The morning wind was cool and clean in the Wyoming plains, carrying the smell of pine and earth. The land stretched wide and empty, broken only by a slow river and a few cottonwood trees. In the middle of that lonely land stood a woman named Clara Jennings. She was not young and not old, but her eyes carried a quiet fire. She had arrived 2 weeks ago with only a wagon, a tired horse, and a plan that most men in town called foolish. She had come to build a home with her own hands. Her land was a small patch at the edge of the valley, bought with every coin she had saved after years of working in a sawmill back east. She wanted peace, her own roof, her own life, and so, from the first sunrise, she had started her work. She lifted the logs one by one, rolling them into place, hammering with steady, stubborn effort. Her palms grew red, her shoulders ached, but she kept going. The townsfolk had watched her from a distance. Some stopped by on their way to the river, shaking their heads. "A woman can't build a cabin alone," one man said. "She'll last a week, maybe 2, another whispered. But Clara paid no mind. She had heard such words all her life. When she worked in the mill, when she tried to buy land, when she said she wanted to live free, men laughed then too. Yet she kept her calm smile, knowing she didn't need their permission to live her dream. Not far from her patch of land across the ridge lived Elias Turner. He was a cowboy by trade, a widower by fate. 5 years had passed since he lost his wife and little boy to a fever that swept through the valley. Since that day, his ranch had felt empty. No laughter, no warmth, just the sound of wind through the fence posts. He had learned to live quietly, rising before dawn, feeding his horses, fixing fences, and sleeping under the soft creak of his old roof. The first time he saw Clara, he had been riding out to check his cattle near the creek. From a distance, he noticed someone moving slowly between the trees, lifting logs with surprising strength. He stopped his horse and watched for a long while. The sun was high, her face was flushed, and sweat ran down her neck, but she didn't stop. She carried herself with the kind of steady courage Elias had not seen in years. He found himself returning to that ridge the next morning, and the one after that. He told himself it was curiosity or maybe concern. No one could last long building alone, but deep down he knew it was something else. He was drawn to her silence, her effort, her stubborn will that reminded him of a part of himself he thought he had buried with his family. Each day, Clara rose early, fed her horse, and began her work. She cut small notches in the logs, fitted them together, and tied them with rope before hammering them into place. Sometimes she paused to breathe or to drink from her tin cup, her eyes wandering toward the wide mountains in the distance. The mornings were peaceful then, only the sound of the hammer echoing through the valley. At night she sat by the fire, eating beans and bread, writing in a small book she kept hidden under her blanket. She wrote about her progress, her thoughts, her memories of the town she left behind. In those pages she confessed her fears, how sometimes the silence scared her, how she missed hearing another voice. But then she wrote about her hope too. "One log at a time," she wrote one evening. "That's how life is built." Elias often saw the smoke from her campfire in the distance. It became a quiet comfort for him. The thought that someone else was awake out there in the wide dark made his ranch feel less empty. He began to notice small things. How she lined her logs neatly, how she stacked her firewood in perfect rows, how her horse followed her like a friend. There was grace in her work, and a kind of sadness too. Sometimes when he rode into town, he heard people talking about her at the general store. "That woman's crazy," one man said. "Building a house alone, she's just asking for trouble." Another laughed. "Maybe she's waiting for a husband to come along and finish it for her." Elias didn't join in. He just filled his bag with flour and nails, paid quietly, and left. But as he rode back, the words stayed with him. He couldn't understand how people could mock someone for trying. One late afternoon he saw her again, struggling to lift a log that was clearly too heavy for her. She pushed, pulled, and tried again, but it wouldn't move. Elias tightened his grip on his reins, wanting to ride down and help her, but he stopped himself. He knew pride when he saw it. A woman like Clara would not want pity. She wanted respect. So he stayed where he was, watching until the sun sank low and finally saw her succeed. The log rolled into place and she let out a tired laugh that carried faintly through the wind. That sound stayed with Elias all night. He sat by his lamp, polishing his saddle, and found himself smiling without realizing it. He thought of his wife, who used to hum while cooking, and of his son, who used to laugh at the sound of thunder. He had buried his joy with them, but now, somehow, watching that stranger build her cabin made his heart feel alive again. A few days later, Clara saw him for the first time. She was walking toward the river with a bucket when she noticed a man on horseback near the ridge. He lifted his hat politely. She nodded back, unsure who he was, then went about her business. Later that day, she found a small bundle by her wagon, 2 nails and a strip of leather. There was no note, but she knew who had left it. She smiled faintly and whispered, "Thank you, stranger." From that day, something unseen connected them. They rarely spoke, but they noticed each other in small ways. When Elias rode by, Clara would pause her work for a moment and nod in greeting. When she struggled with a fallen log, Elias would appear an hour later to leave her a tool she needed. Neither said much, yet both felt less alone. Days turned into weeks. Her cabin walls grew taller, and Elias's heart grew restless. He began to look forward to those quiet glimpses of her hair tied back, her boots dusty, her spirit shining stronger each day. He realized he wasn't just watching a woman build a cabin. He was watching someone rebuild her life from nothing, the way he wished he could rebuild his own. One evening, as the sun painted the valley gold, Clara leaned against a half-built wall, looking out at the land she now called home. She felt tired but proud. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from something. She was creating something. She didn't know that on a nearby hill, a cowboy watched her with quiet admiration, his hat low, his thoughts full of things he didn't yet understand. That night, the stars came out clear and bright over the valley. Clara sat by her fire, warming her hands, and Elias sat on his porch gazing at the same stars. Neither knew the other's thoughts, but both felt the same quiet pull in their hearts, a soft, unspoken sense that maybe, just maybe, life still had something kind left to offer. And while the night wind swept gently across the land, carrying the scent of pine and hope, a cabin began to rise, and 2 lonely souls, without knowing it, had already begun to build something even stronger than walls. The next few days brought heavy clouds across the valley. The wind began to shift, carrying the smell of rain. Clara noticed it early one morning when she stepped out of her tent. The air was cool, the sky dark, and the mountains were wrapped in gray mist. She knew a storm was coming, but she didn't stop working. She had nearly finished the cabin walls, and the roof needed to go up before the rain came. Her hands trembled from exhaustion, but she didn't complain. She worked through the morning, hammering, lifting, and tying. Each log felt heavier than the last. She told herself just one more, over and over. Her horse, Maple, stood tied to a post nearby, watching quietly as thunder rumbled in the distance. By noon, the wind was sharp, throwing dust into her face. She could see the dark clouds rolling in fast, the kind that didn't wait for anyone. She hurried to throw a tarp over the open roof, hoping it would hold until morning. As she climbed the ladder, the first drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, the sky opened and the rain came down hard. Far away, Elias Turner had been out checking his herd. He looked toward the hills and saw the storm sweeping straight toward Clara's land. His stomach tightened. He knew how quickly these storms could turn dangerous. Logs could fall, roofs could collapse, and the river could flood. Without thinking twice, he turned his horse and rode straight into the storm. The rain hit his face like needles, and the wind roared in his ears. The ground turned slick, but Elias pushed his horse forward. When he reached Clara's clearing, he saw her on the roof, fighting to tie down the tarp as the wind whipped it from her hands. She looked small against the storm, soaked through but still refusing to give up. "Clara," he shouted over the thunder. She turned, surprised to see him. "Get down from there," he called again. "I can't," she yelled back. "If I stop now, the whole roof will be ruined." Elias didn't argue. He jumped off his horse and climbed the ladder after her. Together they fought against the wind, their hands slipping on the wet wood. He held one side of the tarp while she tied the ropes as fast as she could. Their eyes met briefly through the rain, and for a moment, it felt like the world around them disappeared. Only the sound of their breathing and the storm remained. Finally, they managed to secure the tarp, both of them gasping from the effort. Elias guided her down carefully, his hand steady on her arm. When they reached the ground, she tried to thank him, but her voice was lost in the wind. He led her to her tent, where she wrapped a blanket around herself and sat by her small fire. "You didn't have to come," she said softly, her voice shaking. "I know," Elias replied, taking off his soaked hat, "but I couldn't just watch." For a moment they sat in silence, listening to the rain pounding on the tarp above them. The light from the fire danced across their faces, and Clara looked at him more closely now. He looked older up close, with lines around his eyes and sadness in his gaze, but there was kindness too. Steady, quiet kindness that made her chest ache a little. After a while, Elias stood up. "You'll be fine for the night?" he asked. Clara nodded. "I will, and thank you," she said again, her voice soft but sincere. He tipped his hat, gave a small smile, and left into the rain. Clara watched him ride away until he disappeared into the storm. For the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone. The next morning, the valley was still wet, but the sun broke through the clouds. Steam rose from the grass, and the air smelled of fresh rain and pine. Clara stepped outside to check the cabin. The tarp had held. Most of the wood was safe. She smiled quietly, grateful to the man who had helped her when she needed it most. That afternoon, she heard the sound of hooves again. Elias returned, carrying a small bag on his saddle. "You might need these," he said, handing her some nails and dry cloth. "Storms like that tend to return." Clara smiled faintly. "You really didn't have to." "I know," he said simply. "But I wanted to." From that day forward, Elias began stopping by once in a while. Sometimes he brought supplies, sometimes just conversation. They spoke little at first, simple words about weather, work, or the land. But there was comfort in those short talks. He helped her fix the fence once when a branch had fallen on it. Another time he taught her how to tighten a saddle strap properly. In return, she shared some of her bread and tea, and they sat together quietly, watching the sky change colors in the evening. Slowly, their friendship began to grow. Clara, who had kept her heart locked for years, began to feel a warmth she didn't expect. She noticed how Elias always looked at the land before speaking, as if weighing every word. She noticed how he handled animals gently, how he laughed softly when her horse tried to steal his hat. Elias, too, began to change. He found himself thinking of her during his long rides. When he passed the general store, he'd glance at the supplies, wondering if she needed anything. His home, once filled only with silence, now felt less empty. He even started fixing the old swing on his porch, something he hadn't touched since his wife's passing. But both of them carried their own fears. Clara had learned to rely only on herself. She didn't know how to let someone in again. Elias had lost everything once and was afraid of feeling that pain again. So they moved carefully, like two people walking across thin ice, close, but afraid to break what little peace they had found. One evening, Clara was working by the cabin when she saw Elias walking up the hill carrying a small wooden frame. "I made this," he said, handing it to her. It was a simple window frame, smooth and sturdy. "A home needs light." Clara touched the wood gently. "And heart," she said with a small smile. He smiled too, and that moment stayed with them both. As days passed, the people in town began to talk. Some of them didn't like seeing Clara and Elias together. They whispered when Elias came to town. "That widow's got him wrapped around her finger," one man joked. Another said, "He's lost his mind helping that woman." When the gossip reached Clara, it hurt more than she wanted to admit. She didn't want Elias to be mocked because of her. So, the next time he came by, she tried to act distant. "You don't need to keep helping me," she said coldly as he dismounted. Elias looked confused. "I don't mind. I like helping." "It's better if you stop," she insisted, her voice trembling a little. "People are talking." Elias stood there quietly, the weight of her words sinking in. He wanted to say that he didn't care about what others thought, that he only cared about her, but he didn't. He just nodded slowly. "If that's what you want," he said, his voice heavy. She turned away before he could see the tears in her eyes. Elias mounted his horse and rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. The valley felt colder that evening, emptier. Clara went back to her cabin, staring at the logs they had lifted together, the window frame he had made, and the quiet fire burning in her stove. She told herself she had done the right thing, but her chest felt hollow. Elias didn't come back for several days. The ridge felt lifeless without his visits. Clara worked harder than ever, but every sound of hooves in the distance made her heart jump. Still, he didn't return. And yet, even as they stayed apart, neither could forget the other. Elias sat by his fire at night, staring at the stars, wondering if she was all right. Clara sat by hers, looking toward the ridge, wondering if he missed her too. The storm had passed, but inside both their hearts, a new kind of storm had begun. One made of longing pride, and the quiet ache of two lonely souls who had found something precious, only to lose it again before they understood what it meant. The days passed slowly after Elias stopped coming. The valley seemed quieter, almost too quiet. Clara tried to fill her hours with work, cutting wood, fixing the roof, caring for her horse, but every sound felt hollow. The laughter she once had while talking to him was gone, replaced by the heavy sound of her hammer echoing in the open air. Each morning, she looked toward the ridge where his ranch stood, though she pretended she wasn't. And each evening, when the sun dropped behind the mountains, she found herself thinking of his calm voice, his steady hands, the way he said her name like it was something worth saying. Elias, too, felt the silence press against him. He hadn't meant to stay away this long. Each time he thought about riding back, the same doubt stopped him. She asked me to stay away, he reminded himself. She doesn't need me. But deep down he knew that wasn't the full truth. He missed her more than he wanted to admit. One late afternoon, Elias rode to town for supplies. Inside the small general store, he heard the same voices again. "You seen that woman still working on her cabin?" one man said. "Ain't right, a woman out there alone. Guess she scared off the cowboy who helped her." Laughter filled the room. Elias stood in the corner, his jaw tightening. He said nothing, paid for his flour and tools, and walked out without a word. As he rode home, he couldn't stop thinking about the cruel things people said so easily. He wished he could protect Clara from their talk, but maybe the best way to do that was to respect her wish and stay away. That night, the wind blew hard through the valley. Elias sat on his porch staring at the stars. He remembered how Clara once said, "One log at a time." She had meant building her home, but now he thought maybe she had meant something more. Life, healing, starting over. He wondered if she still believed it. A few days later, Clara woke to a soft knock on her door. She hesitated, then opened it to find Mrs. Harper, an older woman from town standing with a small basket. "Just thought you could use some bread," the woman said kindly. Clara thanked her and invited her in. They talked for a while about small things, the weather, the harvest, the new families moving west. But before she left, Mrs. Harper looked at her closely and said, "Don't pay mind to the talk in town, dear. Folks gossip because they have nothing better to do. You keep living your way." After she left, Clara stood at the window for a long time. She realized how much she had let other people's words guide her. She had worked so hard to build a life of her own, only to let rumors take away the one friendship that had made her days warm again. That night, she sat by the fire and took out her small notebook. She wrote slowly, her handwriting uneven from the emotion she felt. "He helped me when no one else did. I pushed him away because I was scared. But what am I so afraid of? Losing something I never really had? Or losing myself again?" The next morning, she tied her hair back and decided to finish the last section of the cabin. It was time to add the shutters and finish the porch. She worked with more energy than usual, as if keeping her hands busy could quiet her heart. Around noon, she heard hooves in the distance. Her pulse quickened before she could stop it. She turned and saw Elias riding along the ridge. He wasn't coming her way. He was just passing, maybe checking his cattle. She froze for a moment, watching. He didn't look in her direction. He just rode on slowly, the sunlight flashing off his hat. When he disappeared behind the trees, Clara stood there for a while, her hands trembling slightly. She felt both relief and sadness. Relief that he was near, sadness that he hadn't stopped. But maybe she deserved that distance. That evening, as the sky turned pink and orange, she sat on the porch steps, looking out at the land. The cabin was almost done. The roof was strong, the windows clear, the door newly painted. It was everything she had dreamed of, and yet it didn't feel complete. She realized it wasn't the cabin that made her feel lonely. It was the quiet that followed every sunset, the silence where a voice used to be. Days later, the valley was filled with the sound of chopping wood again. Elias was preparing for winter, cutting logs and stacking them near his barn. But even the rhythm of his axe couldn't drown out the thoughts of Clara. He remembered her laugh, her determination, the look in her eyes when she refused to quit. He missed that look. One afternoon, his neighbor, Old Man Harris, stopped by. "Heard you been helping that lady with her cabin," the old man said. Elias nodded slightly. "Used to," he replied. "Not anymore." Harris leaned on his cane. "She's a good one. I've seen her ride into town. Got spirit. Don't let the talk bother you, son. Folks in this valley forget. Life's too short to spend it alone. Those words stayed with Elias long after the man left. That night he found himself walking into his barn, looking at the extra lumber he had left from his repairs. He picked up a few planks, then put them down again. His heart felt torn. Should he go to her? Would she even want to see him? Meanwhile, Clara worked late into the night, hammering the final board into her porch railing. The moonlight fell softly across her hands. She was tired but proud. She had done it. The cabin stood tall, warm, and safe. She leaned against the post, staring at the land she now owned. It was hers, every inch of it built by her hands. But even as pride filled her chest, a quiet tear rolled down her cheek. She wished someone had been there to see it finished. In the following days, Clara started going to town for supplies again. People still whispered, but she walked with her head high. She was stronger now, strong enough not to care. She even stopped by the post office to send a letter to her cousin back east. "I'm well," she wrote. "The cabin is standing. The land is good. I've learned that sometimes the hardest work isn't lifting wood. It's opening your heart again." One late afternoon, while returning from town, she saw Elias ahead on the trail. He was walking beside his horse, adjusting the saddle strap. Their eyes met for the first time in weeks. Neither spoke for a moment. Then he nodded politely. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," she replied softly. They both stood awkwardly, unsure of what to say. The air was warm, filled with the smell of dust and wildflowers. Finally, Clara smiled faintly. "You still fixing things for everyone else?" Elias gave a small grin. Old habits die hard. Something eased between them then. They walked together for a bit, their steps quiet. She told him the cabin was finally finished. He said he had seen it from the ridge and that it looked strong. For the first time in weeks, they laughed, softly but truly. When they reached the fork in the road, they stopped. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, "for everything you did before." "You don't owe me thanks," Elias replied. "You built that place yourself." "I might have built it," she said, looking at him. "But you reminded me I wasn't alone." He looked down, his throat tight with words he couldn't say. "You never were," he murmured. They stood there for a moment longer, the air still and gentle around them. Then, as the sun dipped low, Elias tipped his hat and rode off toward his ranch. Clara watched him go, a small smile playing on her lips. Something had changed. The distance between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a space that might soon be crossed. That night, as she sat by her fire, she felt peaceful for the first time in a long while. The cabin glowed warmly in the moonlight, and somewhere across the valley a cowboy sat by his own fire thinking of her. Neither of them knew what would come next, but both understood something important. That the strongest homes aren't built only from logs and nails. They're built from courage, forgiveness, and quiet hearts learning to trust again. A few peaceful weeks passed. The weather turned cooler and the nights grew longer. The sky in the Wyoming Valley became brighter with stars, and frost began to paint the grass silver each morning. Clara spent most of her time inside the cabin now. It felt warm and safe. She cooked simple meals, stacked firewood, and mended clothes by the light of her lantern. Each creak of the wooden walls reminded her of the work she had done, of every swing of the hammer, every drop of sweat, and every quiet evening she had spent alone. Sometimes, she would step out onto the porch at dusk and look across the land. In the distance, she could see the faint light from Elias's ranch. It glowed softly through the trees, steady and comforting. She didn't see him often, but somehow just knowing he was out there made her feel less alone. One evening, while she was cooking, the wind suddenly changed. It came fast and cold, carrying the scent of rain again. The sky darkened quickly, faster than before. She stepped outside and saw clouds rolling over the hills, thick and heavy. Thunder rumbled far away, deep and angry. Her stomach tightened. She had lived through storms before, but something about this one felt different. Stronger, sharper. She hurried to cover her supplies, tied her horse under the shelter, and checked the roof. The air felt electric. By the time she got back inside, rain had already started to fall. The wind howled around the cabin, shaking the door. She sat near the fire, hugging her blanket tight. Then came a flash of lightning, so bright it lit up the whole room, and a sharp crack of thunder that followed almost instantly. For a moment she froze. Then she smelled it, the sharp, bitter scent of burning wood. Her heart leapt. She ran to the door and saw the corner of her cabin roof glowing orange. Lightning had struck one of the upper logs and now fire was spreading fast. Without thinking, she grabbed a bucket, ran into the rain, and began throwing water on the flames. The wind fought her, blowing sparks into the night air. Her hands burned as she worked, her heart pounding with fear. "Not again," she whispered to herself. "Please, not again." She had come too far, worked too hard to lose it all now. Miles away, Elias was in his barn when he noticed the sky to the east flickering strangely. He stepped outside, squinting through the rain. A faint orange glow pulsed in the distance. His chest went tight. There was only one cabin in that direction, Clara's. He didn't even grab his coat. He saddled his horse and rode hard through the storm. The rain hit like cold stones and the wind nearly knocked him sideways, but he didn't stop. His mind was full of images. Clara trapped, Clara hurt, Clara alone in the fire. He pushed his horse faster, the hooves splashing mud with every stride. When he reached her clearing, his fears became real. The cabin roof was half on fire, and Clara was still trying to fight it with a bucket, her face pale from smoke. "Clara!" he shouted. She turned, shocked to see him through the storm. "Get back," she yelled.
"It's too dangerous."
But Elias ignored her. He jumped off his horse and ran straight toward the flames. Together they worked desperately, throwing water, pulling burning boards away and stamping out embers that fell onto the porch. Smoke stung their eyes and sparks burned their clothes, but they didn't stop. The rain grew heavier, finally helping them. Bit by bit, the flames weakened. The fire hissed under the downpour until only smoke and steam rose into the dark air. Clara dropped to her knees, coughing and crying, her hands shaking. Elias knelt beside her, breathing hard. "It's all right," he said softly. "It's over." She looked at him, her eyes full of tears. "It's not all right," she whispered. "Half the roof is gone. Everything inside is wet and ruined. I can't start again." Elias looked at the wreckage, the blackened logs, the collapsed corner of the roof, the ashes glowing faintly in the rain. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "You built it once," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "You can build it again. But this time you won't do it alone." Clara stared at him for a long moment. His face was soaked, his hair dripping, but his eyes were steady, filled with the same strength she had seen when he climbed onto her roof weeks ago. Something inside her broke then, not from pain, but from relief. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his shoulder, letting the tears fall freely. He didn't say a word. He just stayed there, holding her while the rain fell around them. When morning came, the storm was gone. The sky was clean and blue, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. Smoke still curled gently from the burned section of the cabin, but most of it still stood. Elias walked the perimeter, checking what could be saved. Clara followed him, silent but calmer now. "We can reuse these logs," he said, pointing. "The inside wall's still solid." "It's not as bad as it looks," Clara sighed, her eyes tired. "I don't have the strength to do it again." Elias turned to her. "Then I'll lend you mine," he said simply. "We'll rebuild it together." For the first time in a long while, Clara didn't argue. She just nodded slowly. Word about the fire spread quickly through the small town. At first, people came just to look, whispering among themselves. But when they saw Elias already working, lifting new beams into place, something changed. A few men offered to help. Mrs. Harper brought food. Even the same people who had once gossiped began to bring tools, nails, and timber. For days, the valley buzzed with life. Hammers echoed, saws rasped, and laughter filled the air. Clara worked side by side with Elias, her strength returning. Every time she grew tired, he was there with a gentle word or a steady hand. When he saw her smile for the first time since the fire, he knew he'd made the right choice coming back. One afternoon, while they were setting the new roof beams, Elias looked down at her and said, "You know, you've changed this place." She glanced up at him, brushing sweat from her forehead. "How so?" he smiled. "It used to be just another quiet valley. Now it feels like it's alive." She laughed softly. Maybe it just needed a little noise. By the end of the week, the new cabin stood taller and stronger than before. The walls were thicker, the roof lower against the wind, and the porch wide enough for 2 chairs side by side. The townspeople helped raise the last log, cheering when it was done. Even Elias smiled wide, something he hadn't done in years. That evening, when everyone had gone, Clara stood on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky burned with gold and red. Elias walked up beside her, holding 2 tin cups of warm coffee. He handed her one. "Looks better than before," he said quietly. She nodded. "It does." They stood in silence, sipping slowly, the air filled with the soft sounds of birds and the crackle of the new fire inside. Clara looked at him, her heart full of words she couldn't quite speak. "Thank you," she finally said, "for saving my home, for coming back." Elias met her eyes, his expression gentle. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You gave me something to come back for." Clara felt her throat tighten. The wind moved softly through the grass, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. She realized then that the cabin wasn't the only thing being rebuilt. Her heart was too. Later that night, she sat by the new hearth, listening to the fire crackle. The cabin glowed warmly, every shadow soft and familiar. Outside, the stars returned, brighter than before. She thought of how much had been lost and how much had been found again. Life, she realized, wasn't about avoiding storms. It was about having someone who would ride through them to reach you. And across from her, sitting quietly by the door, Elias smiled to himself as he watched her. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew this place was no longer just her dream. It was theirs, a home born from ashes, built not only from wood but from trust, courage, and something quietly beautiful growing between two lonely hearts. The valley looked different after the fire. The grass had grown greener, the air seemed softer, and the cabin that once stood in ashes now stood proudly against the horizon. Its walls glowed gold under the morning sun, and smoke curled gently from the chimney like a sign of life. Inside, Clara Jennings moved quietly, making coffee while the fire warmed the room. The smell of pine wood and bread filled the air. It had been 2 months since the fire. The days had passed slowly but with purpose. Every morning, Elias rode down from his ranch to help her fix one thing or another: fence posts, doors, steps, or windows. And every evening he stayed for supper. At first, Clara thought of it as kindness, but she soon realized something deeper. Elias wasn't just helping her rebuild the cabin. He was rebuilding his own life alongside hers. She had started to look forward to the sound of his horse approaching. It brought comfort, like knowing the day would end with laughter and peace instead of silence. Even her horse Maple had begun to recognize him and would snort happily when he arrived. The quiet space between them had slowly filled with trust and warmth. One afternoon, Elias came carrying a small wooden box. "Made something," he said shyly as he stepped inside. Clara wiped her hands and smiled. "You're always making something." He placed the box on the table and opened it carefully. Inside was a locket made of polished wood shaped like a heart. When she opened it, she saw a tiny carving of a cabin on one side and a small sun rising behind it on the other. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her eyes soft. He shrugged lightly. "A home needs something to remind it what it's for." She looked at him, touched beyond words. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," he said simply, and for a long moment they just stood there looking at each other, the air warm and still between them. The days turned longer as spring came. Snow melted in the higher mountains and the river near Clara's land ran full again. Flowers bloomed across the field, painting the ground with color. Life felt gentle again, as if the valley itself was healing alongside them. One morning, Elias brought 2 chairs to the porch. "A porch isn't finished until it's got a place to sit," he said with a grin. Clara laughed and helped him place them side by side. From that day on, it became their routine to sit there together in the evenings. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just listened to the crickets and the soft hum of wind through the grass. It was quiet, but it was a good kind of quiet, the kind that feels full rather than empty. As the weeks went on, the people in town stopped talking. Some even began to admire them. "That woman built a life from nothing," they'd say, "and that cowboy found his heart again." But for Elias and Clara, none of that mattered. They didn't build their days for others to see. They built them for the peace that came from small moments, sharing coffee at sunrise, working side by side, feeding the animals together, or watching the stars in silence. Still, Elias carried one question quietly in his heart. He had loved once before and lost everything. Now every time he looked at Clara, he felt that love return, but he didn't know if he was ready to speak it aloud. One evening he tried to find the courage. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset turn the sky to gold. Clara had her hands folded around her cup. The soft light touched her face, and for a moment Elias thought she looked like something out of a dream. Strong, gentle, and real. He cleared his throat. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "you ever think about what comes next?" She turned to him. "Next?" He nodded. "You built your home. You built your life again. But what comes after?" She smiled faintly, looking out at the horizon. "I used to think the answer was survival. To keep going no matter what. But now," she paused, her voice soft, "now I think it's sharing. A life isn't meant to be lived alone forever. I just never thought I'd meet someone who understood that." Elias's heart thumped once hard. He wanted to say everything right then, but before he could, she added quietly, "I know what it's like to lose someone, Elias. I know how it feels to close your heart and call it safety, but sometimes healing means opening that door again, even if it scares you." He looked at her, the setting sun glinting in his eyes. "It scares me every day," he admitted. Clara reached over and took his rough hand in hers. "Then maybe we'll be scared together." He laughed softly, the sound warm and full. "I think I can live with that." From that evening on, something changed. They no longer needed to pretend their connection was just friendship. They began sharing their mornings and evenings like two people who had been waiting a long time for peace. Elias started staying longer, fixing things slower just to be near her. Clara found herself cooking extra portions, smiling more, and humming to herself while working. One Sunday morning, the pastor from town stopped by. He was an old man with kind eyes and a curious smile. "Heard you two built something beautiful out here," he said. "And I don't just mean the cabin." Elias and Clara exchanged a look and smiled shyly. The pastor chuckled. "If you ever decide to make it official, you know where the church is." After he left, Clara laughed softly. "Seems even the valley knows about us now." Elias rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed. "Guess it does." But that evening, while the stars rose, Elias walked out to the edge of the porch, staring up at the sky. He thought of his late wife and son, how much they had meant to him and how hard it had been to live after losing them. But now, for the first time, he felt peace about it. He whispered a quiet thank you to the wind, as if letting go of his sorrow once and for all. The next day, Elias came early. Clara was by the river washing clothes. He walked over quietly, holding something in his hand. It was a simple silver ring. "It belonged to my mother," he said softly. "I kept it all these years. Thought I'd never have a reason to give it away, but now, I think maybe it's time." Clara looked up, her eyes wide. "Elias." He smiled gently. "You don't have to answer now. I just wanted you to know this place, this cabin, this life, it doesn't feel right unless you're in it." She stood there for a long moment, the river whispering beside them. Then she nodded slowly. "You've already given me everything I needed, Elias. But if you're asking me to stay for good, then yes." He didn't move right away. He just smiled. The kind of smile that carried years of pain finally turned into peace. Then he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Weeks later, they married quietly under the cottonwood tree near the cabin. Mrs. Harper baked the bread. The pastor read the vows, and a few neighbors stood smiling in the sunshine. It wasn't grand, but it was full of heart. When the ceremony ended, Elias looked at Clara and said softly, "You built your home one log at a time. I'm just grateful I got to be part of it." Clara smiled, her eyes glimmering with tears. "You didn't just help me build a home," she whispered. "You helped me build a life." Years passed, and travelers who rode through the valley often saw that same cabin still standing strong. On the porch sat a tall cowboy with silver hair and a woman with gentle eyes sitting side by side, watching the sunsets together. They had no grand riches, no fame, but their life was full. The laughter of visiting children, the smell of fresh bread, the creak of the rocking chairs, and the peace of two souls who had once been broken but found wholeness in each other. And when the wind blew across the valley at night, carrying the soft sound of their laughter, it felt as if the land itself was smiling. Because from the ashes of storms and sorrow, love had been rebuilt, one log, one day, one heart at a time.